COPs. And with that, I would like to open our last session of the 6th day of COP28. This session is called Clergy Tell Stories from the Front Lines of the Climate Crisis, and it's been organized by the Interfaith Center on Sustainable Development, as well as Greenfaith. And I hand over to David. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. Appreciate all of you being here so late in the day. My name is David Miron-Wapner. I am proud to serve as the board chair of the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development based in Jerusalem. And we have been part of the core team in organizing this first Faith Pavilion at a COP. A great Jewish sage, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav, taught, "The whole world is a narrow bridge. The essence is not to fear." In all of our work, I am sure, we all pass across a bridge. To make it requires walking lightly, balance, harmony, and humility. I have been an environmental activist for, well, it seems like nearly 50 years. And I am so because I subscribe to the biblical prophetic imperative to repair our broken world. I came of age in the 60s in California. Unaware of it at the time, I was seemingly on the front lines of what preceded the climate crisis. I grew up in suffocating Southern California, where we were advised as children not to play outdoors on certain days. And that was really, really hard to pay attention to. Air pollution, however, in Los Angeles was really primarily local. The climate crisis is global, albeit with powerful, pernicious local impacts. At its heart, climate is a crisis of the human spirit. And we have heard that over and over from one speaker after the next at this Faith Pavilion. It demands a paradigm shift in human consciousness. And to make that transition, we need wise, compassionate, spiritual leadership. In my humble view, the climate crisis has roots in the all-prevalent illusion of separate egos. We see ourselves as apart from one another, apart from and not an integral part of humanity and the natural world. So before I proceed to the panelists who have a great deal, I'm sure, to share with you today, I would like to ask each of you to engage in a very few moments of a simple act of repair and connection. Turn to someone nearby, introduce yourself to him or to her, and look one another in the eye and perceive your common humanity. Thank you. So I shared a little bit of my story growing up in the 60s in Los Angeles. Now it's time to hear stories from spiritual leaders who really find themselves on the front lines of the climate crisis. So I would like to turn first to Bishop Marika Markovits of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of Sweden.
Thank you. And thank you. I also want to say thank you to the Faith Pavilion, who gives us this interreligious meeting place to show that the climate crisis is a human spiritual challenge that really can unite the world religions. At least that is my experience from the interreligious work in Sweden, that the climate issues really unite us over the religious borders. I grew up in the 1970s in Sweden, and in the capital city of Stockholm, who is said to be the city of islands with a lot of water surrounding it. When I was a child, it was forbidden to bathe, to swim in the water. We had only basins where you were allowed, where clean water, where you were allowed to swim, because the water was so polluted. When I was 20 years old, we had managed together to clean the water, and from then until now, 40 years, it is totally healthy to swim in the water. But since then, I've seen how the other things has gone in a total different direction. For instance, biological diversity has become less and less every year. We see less of insects in the cities, and we see how animals are leaving the countryside, moving into cities because they can't feed in a normal way anymore in the forests. I engaged in the environmental issues when I was quite young, as a teenager. And I also at the same time engaged in the church. At that time, the church theology that was preached was really dividing nature and human value. And telling me as a young person that I shouldn't put animals and nature at the same level of importance as human beings. Since then, a big shift has happened theologically in the Church of Sweden. Today, we talk about fellow creatures and fellow, as well as we talk of fellow humans. And we have reached a total different understanding of the spiritual and how we are connected to all living creatures in the world, and that is a deep, profound spiritual change of way of thinking. I am a very new bishop, only 10 months back, but I'm the new bishop of a diocese that have been working with environmental questions the last 30 years actively. And the last 4 years, we have, as a Church of Sweden, with 5.6 million members, we have a plan for climate, how to we have a climate roadmap that will have 3 goals: climate neutrality in 2030. We also want to work with change in values and climate justice. Those are the 3 goals that we're working with. In my diocese, there is a long tradition of combining, especially to work with climate, to change of values. And we do that through pilgrimage, to go out in nature. Actually, we have a change so that many times we celebrate our Sunday service by going out in nature. And by walking and experiencing nature, we also feel interrelated to it, and we embrace nature and our experiences of being related to nature into our Sunday service in every moment of the Sunday service. And that is a great tradition to go into and carry on as a bishop. I think I stop there now as an introduction, and I just want to say that even though we have the pilgrimage as a center of working with value changing, we struggle a lot with that point. The 2 other points, the more material way of working with this roadmap, the climate roadmap, that is working with the carbon neutrality and working with the climate justice. There we have a lot of tools how to work with it. But to work with the change of values, we still lack important tools to make that happen on a broader sense. And I think the world actually is also struggling with how to change our values so that it actually is shown in our way of thinking, in our way of living our lives. And I'd like to talk more about that in this panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bishop Marika. I'm glad, Reverend James, that you were able to join us. I know you made a quick transition from a previous panel, but I would very much appreciate your sharing with us your story, which is clearly on the front lines, coming from Pacific island nations. You are from Fiji. Please share your story about how climate is impacting your community.
Thank you, David. I think the world knows how climate is impacting the Pacific. Everybody knows our story because we are the poster children of climate change. I think reflecting on this, on the title of this panel and our sharing this afternoon, I want to look at two front lines. Because often when we talk about the front lines of the climate crisis, we only talk about the vulnerability of our people and the impacts of climate change, which are, of course, huge. The pastoral care that is required for people in the midst of the impacts of climate change, whether it's rising sea levels, whether it's extreme weather patterns, whether it's engaging with the communities to explain, firstly, God is not punishing them, God is with them in their difficulties. That it's not because of anybody's, well, actually, I'll rephrase that. It's not because of their sin, because they are the least emitting countries and communities. It is part of an ecological sin, of course, the unabated burning of fossil fuels, but also to encourage them to let them grieve and tell their stories. Our journey with our people as they grieve, but the challenge also that the very people who are pastoring to these communities are part of the community that is affected. So then, this need of working with not just the communities, but working with the pastors themselves that are involved in doing this work. Because they're also experiencing climate change. How do we educate our pastors and train our pastors and do ministerial or spiritual formation in whatever faith group we belong to? How are we training our faith leaders to be faith leaders in the context of climate change when we do their formation and preparation? That's one. The other front line that I'd like to quickly reflect on this afternoon is the front line where we are today. In the room over there, we have space that every morning is dedicated for pastoral care, and in the afternoons for pastoral care for negotiators. I don't know about those who have been in the other days. This morning, Rabbi Jonathan and I were talking about how I was in there today, and he was the only person I saw, and I think he probably counseled me more than the other way around. We were having just some time of sharing because no one came in, because our negotiators were actually exhausted and trying to get some rest before going back in. So I've been, for the last few days, and I will continue until I return home, basing myself in the Moana Blue Pacific Pavilion, where our Pacific delegates are, where our negotiators, leaders, civil society, everybody gathers for events, but also that's their base of operations. And just spending time talking one-on-one with them, checking in how they're doing, encouraging them. And these are people who are fighting for those communities that I've just referred to, right? They are, when we talk about David versus Goliath, this is that kind of battle for them. It is a battle in which they recognize the enormity of the weight that is on their shoulders, not only for the planet, but for the, in a very real sense, because they're fighting for their families and their communities. This isn't a position of employment. This is an act of defending their communities. And that's the other aspect. How do we encourage and support those, whether they're negotiators or civil society or those in government or those who are called to take the moral and ethical leadership of their nation and lead people through unpopular political decisions? Those, for me, are all the people that are involved on the front line from a Pacific perspective. And, in the context of climate action, keeping saying the unpopular things like in this area, fossil fuels need to phase out. In the context of everybody cheering a loss and damage fund saying it's not enough, it needs to take in non-economic loss and damage. How we encourage and support those who have to consistently go up against the wall and, speak truth to power on a daily basis in this place, where power is speaking untruth back to them. So that's the pastoral work that I'm doing, not only back home, but here at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend James. I'd now like to turn, excuse me. Thank you, Reverend James. I'd now like to turn to Maureen Wara of Greenfaith, which is a co-organizer of this session. She is the Global Organizing Director of Greenfaith.
Thank you. I think it's working, I'm not sure. Hello? Is it working? Perfect, thank you. All right, so I think it's evident that I'm not clergy, I'm not wearing a collar, but sitting in for our executive director, and the story I would like to tell in this case is the narrative that I've seen in the frontline communities where I work with faith leaders, where I work. And the story is a story of conflict of crisis or conflict of calling. And this comes up, I think part of it has been mentioned by Reverend James. Conflict of calling where political power kind of is in conflict with the calling of a faith leader. So when they want to intervene, at some point in time, they ask themselves, do I conform to the political current, or do I speak truth to power? And also the story of fear of alienation for grassroots faith communities who are afraid that the structures that may be in the faith sector will alienate them if they decide again to speak truth to power. And there's a lot of loneliness in speaking truth to power, doing the right thing. As much as there's enough will to continue doing the right thing in terms of holding governments accountable, in terms of holding financial institutions, and in terms of trying to speak to and maintain dignity and sanctity of life. But there's a lot of fear of alienation, because then faith leaders at the grassroots level become unpopular. And the structures that need them to have the bureaucratic way of passing information from one office to the next makes them a little bit unpopular, and so they end up feeling alone. And also there's a lot of, status quo maintenance, where these faith leaders feel like the grassroots people are suffering. The frontline communities have been displaced, for example, by flood, but because they cannot name the reluctance of the political offices and the relevant ministries from making rapid decisions of helping people and making sure rapid response is actually rapid, they, and in most cases are not, decide not to say anything because they are afraid of destabilizing the status quo. So it is a story of bravery also, which I have to highlight, because we've got brave faith leaders who decide to for lack of a better word, brave the tide, and decide to speak truth to power, and decide to say something, and decide to do something. So it's a story of anger in this case, where grassroots faith leaders are angry and anxious to do the right thing. They are anxious and angry, and they want to help make sure that they speak truth to power. They are angry and anxious, and they want to make sure that they hold governments accountable to the implementation of the different accords and commitments that are made at the global level. But in most cases, there's very little knowledge that goes also to allowing them to do this, because we find that a global narrative is there, and a national narrative, and probably a local narrative is there that faith leaders cannot do anything. Their job is just to pray. So you'd find that a very powerful or influential faith leader is invited to a discussion where very serious targets are being discussed. But all this faith leader will be asked to do is pray before the meeting starts, or pray when the meeting ends. Not realizing that this person has the history and the library of what happens at the community level. They can be very strategic voices of making sure that they say this is what we need to do in community X, because community X is designed like this. And yet, the paradox is that when this flooding happens, or when drought strikes, or when there's war, the faith leaders are the first respondents. And yet they have very little knowledge. So the story of bravery is there, which I have seen. Right now I'm seeing the story of bravery in Magé, a very local group in Brazil that is fighting against oil spills in a river. And I'm seeing them standing alone and talking alone. So it is a story of realizing the role of faith leaders in terms of curbing the climate disasters. It is a high time we started talking about this, and that is why this faith pavilion to me is God-sent, let me say that, because it makes it possible for people to start seeing that faith leaders are formidable in turning the climate justice agenda. So that is what I can say in the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maureen. I'd now like to turn to my colleague and teacher, Rabbi Yonatan Nerel, to share his story.
Hello, shalom. So I grew up next to an old growth oak tree that the Native Americans harvested. They harvested the acorns, they made it into porridge. And then about 20 years ago, I moved to Jerusalem and have lived there since. And during that time, there was the most serious drought that took place in the Middle East in at least 900 years, but likely longer than that. And that drought caused hundreds of thousands of Syrian farmers to leave their homes and go into Syrian cities after Syria had already been destabilized by the war in Iraq. And so climate change was one cause of the civil war in Syria. There are studies that indicate that as the planet heats up, or as we heat up the planet, that the propensity for violence increases. And so this summer was a record summer in this region, and so we essentially need to be aware that the ecological crisis is with us now, and it's also a spiritual crisis. It's not just about the birds and the bees, the trees and the toads. It's about how we live as spiritual beings in a physical reality. In Genesis chapter 1, we learn the story of creation, and God sees the creation, and God says that it is very good. So we need to love creation, God's creation, and protect it. That's our responsibility. So, and this is something that religious communities can bring to the table, is not, because sometimes the doomsday message that is coming out can be overwhelming for people and can lead people to despair. And so faith communities have the potential to promote hope. Now, the hope that they can promote is not a blind hope that is based on this idea that God will save us no matter how sinful that we are, but rather it's a mature hope that we need to take our responsibility, we need to do what we can, and when we act and when we engage in climate repentance, then God will be with us in this process, and that God is with us, but God is also wanting us to take the appropriate action. So I'm happy to say that yesterday the New York Times published an article about the Faith Pavilion, in which Reverend James Bhagwan and Maureen Wara were quoted, along with Athena Peralta of the World Council of Churches. It's one of the rare times that the New York Times has focused an article on religion and ecology in the past 150 years. So we applaud that, we celebrate that, and we celebrate the efforts of the partners in this Faith Pavilion in the work doing this. And just to relate to something that you, Maureen, said in terms of because over 2 weeks, what's happening here in the Faith Pavilion is probably the largest interfaith ecology event in history. 70 sessions, 325 speakers, and there's a certain level of cross-pollination that's taking place. In this chair and in this chair 2 hours ago sat ministers of environment from 2 countries. And prior to that, actually Pope Francis was supposed to come here in person and give an inaugural address. He ended up getting the flu and unfortunately wasn't able to come. But he gave a video address. Sadhguru, a Hindu religious figure, spoke last week. Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, Gurudev, is speaking in a couple days. We have Muslim religious figures. The Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Al-Tayyib, gave a video address. He was also going to join Pope Francis in coming in person. And we've had Buddhist figures, Zoroastrian, from many faith traditions coming together, calling for climate action. And I'll just finish with a short story that the Nobel laureate Toni Morrison said of a young boy who comes to an elder woman with a bird in his hands. And he says to the elder woman, "Can you tell me whether the bird in my hands is alive or dead?" And the woman looks at the boy, and she realizes that the boy is playing a trick on her. Because if she says that the bird is dead, then he will open his hands and the bird will fly away. And she'll be wrong. And if she says that the bird is alive, he will close his hands and crush the bird, and she'll also be wrong. So she thinks to herself for a minute, and she says to the young boy, "I don't know whether the bird in your hands is alive or dead. All I know is that the life of the bird is in your hands." Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Yonatan. I'd like to now go through a second round for each of you to share how you have been called upon as a person of faith, as a faith leader, to offer counseling. How to the faithful in your community, what guidance have they sought from you? And what practical steps do you encourage to inspire faith-based action to mitigate climate change and build resilience? So we'll start again in the same order we started with Bishop Marika.
Thank you. Well, I think in Sweden we have seen results of climate change in different ways. We have seen wildfires both this summer, but especially in 2018. This year we have had a lot of floods and that has destroyed homes and of course roads and railroads, with also a lot of accidents happening. We also see that the indigenous people, the Samis, engage a lot of difficulties in feeding their reindeers because of the winters are not as it used to be with the rising temperatures. And of course, a lot of damages like this can be actually a question of life and death for individual people. And also they can lose a big economic question, not only to individuals, but actually to whole societies, local societies. And for the minority people, the Samis, this is actually putting their whole lifestyle at stake at the moment. And as a church, we react both on an individual, on a societal, and also as a protector of the indigenous people rights. We work on all these levels. When it comes to when the accident or when the crisis is actually there, we open up the churches, we can organize civilians to help each other at the site where the crisis is. And we also do a lot of I have to search the word in English. We work a lot with advocacy work when it comes to the indigenous people's rights to their land, and for instance also to argue for their right to be respected. For instance, when mining is suggested in their areas where they feed their animals and where they live. But of course, if you look to the crisis, the climate crisis, that how it affects people in Sweden, many times our system of welfare and supporting system are strong because we are a rich country compared to the third world or south countries. So I think that even if we as church leaders we have to act and deliver help locally, we also all the time have to lift up the questions of solidarity with those more vulnerable than us. So a very important part of religious leadership is to help people to raise their eyes and their engagement international to the global south, and to those who are the most vulnerable and are where also most of the global impact is the hardest of the climate crisis. But because we are part of we are really carrying the eco sin, so to say, that we have as one of the richest people with many big corporations, and we've been having huge carbon emissions. And we also therefore have to ask for a big responsibility taking from our government and to do a lot of advocacy work towards that, so that we will be responsible in our environmental politics, not only to minimize our fossil fuel climate problems in Sweden, but actually to support and economically support the transition in other countries where that is also a very important question. I also want to address another. You were talking of different front lines, and in Sweden one very obvious front line is among youth. There is a big sense of hopelessness among Swedish youth. And we have, in Europe, we have the highest psychological, mental some illness or anxiety among young people in all Europe, actually. And many young people say they don't have the effort to look at news anymore because they're losing hope. And so the Church of Sweden are really trying to address those young people and say that we as religious leaders are siding up with them. And we do that, for instance, with the Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg. The church leaders are siding up with them in the cities with demonstrations and asking the government to take responsibility, just to enhance hope among young people. And we also are building up a group of climate ambassadors and empower young people.
Thank you, Bishop. Reverend James, you alluded earlier to having a space here in the Faith Pavilion for pastoral care and counseling, which has not been fully utilized, unfortunately, but I'm sure you are called upon to do similar things in your day-to-day work in your home country.
Yeah, thank you. I just maybe before quickly responding to that, just wanted to maybe respond to two things that have been shared in the panel today. One is about when pastors are invited to only say prayers at meetings. I do a lot of that. And a lot of our regional programs, because of the role of faith in society in the Pacific, that is one of the things I'm often doing, particularly at high-level events. It's a regional meeting, it's a national meeting, let's wheel in the padre to say a prayer. No, I mean, they really want the prayer. But I want to suggest that rather than it being a dismissive aspect of the role of the church in only being reduced to that particular space, the way I see it is the moment in which the agenda is set. Because you are the first person to speak. So when we go into that space, that's what I do. I set the agenda for the day with the right scriptural framing, the right theological framing, and the right prayer. You can empower and mobilize and shift the conversation, in fact. And I mean, sometimes it's good to hijack the agenda because we need the right agenda on the table. So in that sense, there is a very powerful thing to be able to get into that space. Maybe that's why they bring me that side. But I think that is something that I just wanted to respond. In terms of the pastoral care, I mentioned some of those concepts, the challenges, earlier in my first intervention. We have developed a network of disaster trauma counseling, pastoral disaster trauma counseling from a pastoral perspective, because what we recognize is that secular psychosocial responses don't answer the faith question, and often they're not able in our context in the Pacific to answer the indigenous spirituality question as well. And by preparing our pastors or our pastoral response teams to not only be trained in psychosocial training, but to provide the theological and Christian or spiritual pastoral support, that is a way of engaging. And it helps also those who are in those spaces when the disasters happen or when they're facing this issue to process it also. And it's actually a very powerful thing if the person that is providing that counseling or that support is not from outside, but actually in the community. She or he is part of the community that is affected, but is equipped to lead the community in that process. Whether it is a process of grieving, whether it is a process of lamenting, building resilience. If we equip, again, I go back to that idea of equipping the pastoral work in advance, and we need to start putting funding into developing those programs in our theological schools. And that's what, for me, that's one of the key things. How are we supporting this in terms of the ministerial or pastoral formation programs? The other aspect is we build on the resilience of our Pacific people in terms of indigenous knowledge and spirituality, and that, our strength is our community. And so the other aspect, that makes the work easier for us, because innately in our Pacific people is the care for each other. And, in the context of young people, we also have mental health issues for our young people. But we are inspired by our young people who get out there, and our Pacific Climate Warriors say, we're not drowning, we're fighting. And that inspires the others in our community as well. So we take the inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend James. Now, for a few words, I already had the sign that we have about 7 or 8 minutes left. Maureen, I'll turn to you first for some brief remarks to conclude, and then Rabbi Yonatan. Thank you.
So working with Greenfaith, we are actively training grassroots people and grassroots faith leaders so that they can have a factual, evidence-based way of advocating for what they want or asking for what they want. We also make sure that we do a lot of security training, because we know that the financial institutions and the fossil fuel industry is very powerful in that sense. And so if people do not have security training on how to keep themselves safe, even as they are holding their governments accountable and speaking truth to power, then they would always land into trouble. As we know right now, we have 9 students in Uganda who are in prison because they spoke truth to power and they were challenging a project that is going to be detrimental to their community. And also we make sure that we hold a lot of public actions, because my Bible tells me that faith without action is dead. So we make sure that we hold a lot of public actions. We have a global day of action coming up next year, which is one of the interesting and fun things for Greenfaith to do by making sure that visibility and public awareness takes place. From April 25th to March 5th, we have a global day of action where across the world, grassroots faith communities will be making sure that they do actions that are speaking to the climate injustices that are happening in their communities. And also on the theological part, we've launched a regional fellowship program that is digging deep into looking at ecology and theology and environment, that is supposed to look at, when we say building a multi-faith grassroots movement, what does that mean from a theological perspective? And also making sure that we facilitate, making sure that we look for finances and give grassroots organizations to also hold dialogue and dissent actions. In this case, we talk to the opinion shapers and the politicians and the ministries, those who are making sure that regulations are in place, but also hold them accountable by public actions. Thank you.
Thank you, Maureen. Rabbi Yonatan, I'll let you have the last word in this panel.
So I was at a Sabbath meal a few months ago where a young woman and her parents came up to me and she said, yeah, I'm 12 years old, I'm going to school, and I'm going to a religious school, a Jewish day school, and the science teacher taught us about climate change. And I learned of what's happening and that we've passed tipping points. And she said, it seems like there's nothing that we can do. She came to me with a sense of despair. And I said to her, well, did the religious studies department also talk about climate change at your religious school? Did they also share religious wisdom about how we can relate to the crisis from a spiritual perspective? The ecological crisis is a spiritual crisis, and it's also a crisis of religion. Since 87% of people in the world identify with a religion, so therefore we need religions to be fully on board in curbing climate change. They can't sit this one out. A lot of people think that religion is one thing and ecology is another. Religion is about theology and homiletics and hermeneutics. And ecology are those tree huggers and Fridays for Future, and the two don't have any connection. But no, religious institutions are the biggest NGO in the world. They have huge educational institutions, huge media institutions. There are tens of millions of clergy, and so one thing that my organization, the Interfaith Center for Sustainable Development, has been doing has been to try to promote the teaching and preaching on ecology within religious institutions. Raise your hand if you've heard your clergy member speak about climate change in the past month. A few people. Raise your hand if you heard your clergy member speak about climate change in the past year. Okay, a few more. Raise your hand if you've ever heard your clergy member speak about climate change. Okay, so almost everyone, amazing. So right, it should be, so we've developed an eco-preacher resource developed by a Lutheran pastor, which is taking eco-Bible and ecological commentary on the Hebrew Bible and relating it for Christian pastors to teach and preach about this once a month. And so I'll just finish with a few words from David began with Rabbi Nachman of Breslov, who said in Hebrew, Ein yeush ba'olam klal. Never give up hope. We're living in times that our ancestors have been dreaming about for thousands of years. And these are very unique times, and they're also times where the earth is messaging to us that we need a change in consciousness. We need to live at a higher level of spiritual awareness. The human being has many levels of spiritual awareness, and a human being who's operating at the lowest level is very attracted to consumer society. But as humanity evolves in our spiritual awareness, as we lift up our spiritual awareness, we will then come to a place where we then see, as Bishop Marika was saying earlier, the interconnection of all beings, the interdependence of all people and all species. And from that place of interconnection, we will then, with God's help, be able to enable the next generation to inherit a thriving, sustainable, and spiritually aware planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi Yonatan. On that note, I don't think we have time for any questions. So thank you all for being here with us. Reverend James, thank you. Bishop Marika, Maureen Wara, Rabbi Yonatan, thank you for sharing.